Baghdad International Airport, March 31st, 2003. The U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division has just seized a critical objective on the road to Saddam Hussein's regime. American forces are pushing fast and hard into enemy territory. There's no clear front line, just bullets, dust, and confusion. Amid the chaos, a platoon of combat engineers is setting up a makeshift holding area for prisoners. It's supposed to be a rear area job. It's not. Instead, what comes next is a coordinated Iraqi attack. Dozens of enemy troops open fire with mortars, RPGs, and automatic weapons. American soldiers are caught in the open. An M113 is hit. Medics and mechanics are scattered and scrambling for cover. And one man takes control. Sergeant First Class Paul R. Smith, a 33-year-old squad leader with the 11th Engineer Battalion, doesn't hesitate. He directs return fire, moves his men to cover, and then, seeing the situation collapse, climbs into a disabled armored vehicle, mans a .50 caliber machine gun, and begins firing. He is completely exposed. He does it anyway. What follows is one of the fiercest one-man defenses of the Iraq War. Over 100 American lives are on the line, only one man standing between them and overrun. This is not a movie. This is not embellishment. This is real. Paul Ray Smith would be killed in action before the battle ended, but his actions would save his entire position. And 2 years later, he would become the first Medal of Honor recipient in the Iraq War. This is his story. Paul Ray Smith wasn't born a hero. He wasn't a West Point grad or a decorated prodigy. He was a kid from El Paso, Texas, raised in Florida, who struggled in school, liked working with his hands, and needed direction. When the Army came calling, he didn't just enlist, he locked in. He joined the U.S. Army in October 1989 and found his purpose in structure, discipline, and service. His MOS? Combat engineer. That meant demolition, mine clearing, fortifications, dirty, dangerous work that blended technical skill with battlefield grit. And Paul Smith took to it like it was in his DNA. Over time, he became known across his units for one thing above all: intensity. Smith wasn't laid back, he wasn't chill, he was a professional, and he expected everyone around him to act like it too. If you were in his squad, you trained hard, followed orders, and did things right. He drilled his men constantly: live fire rehearsals, battle drills, room clearing, react to contact, repeat. He wasn't always liked, but he was always respected. His soldiers said he had 2 modes, fire and ice. When it was time to train, he was all business. But when it was time to lead, he made damn sure every man knew they were never going into a fight alone. Off duty, Smith was a different man. A husband, a father, a guy who built his own furniture, fixed cars, and called home every chance he got. He wasn't chasing rank. He wasn't chasing fame. He was focused on his team and keeping them alive. By 2003, he was a seasoned NCO in B Company, the 11th Engineer Battalion, attached to the 3rd Infantry Division. The unit was staging in Kuwait, preparing for ground invasion of Iraq. His job: clear paths, blow obstacles, secure positions, under fire if necessary. Smith had been through war before. He deployed to the Gulf in 1991 and to the Balkans. But this time felt different. There was tension in the air. The invasion was moving fast. Intel was thin. The enemy was dug in. Smith doubled down on training. He made his men repeat battle plans. He added extra rehearsals. He told them over and over, you don't rise to the occasion, you fall back on training. And then, quietly, he told one of his team leaders something else. If this goes bad, he said, I want them to say I fought like a lion. He didn't know it yet, but that moment was coming. And when it did, Smith would do more than fight. He'd show the world what leadership under fire really looked like. By late March 2003, the U.S. invasion of Iraq was in full swing. The 3rd Infantry Division, the Army's armored spearhead, was charging up from Kuwait like a hammer. Their mission? Reach Baghdad as fast as possible, dismantle Saddam's regime, and avoid getting bogged down in house-to-house fighting. Attached to this armored juggernaut was B Company, 11th Engineer Battalion, combat engineers trained to breach obstacles, clear minefields, and build defensive positions on the fly. Among them, Sergeant First Class Paul R. Smith. His team was part of Task Force 27 Infantry, nicknamed Task Force Iron. They were lean, fast, and moving deep into enemy territory. With every mile, resistance increased. Bunkers, roadblocks, snipers, Fedayeen in civilian clothes launching hit-and-run attacks. Still, the third ID kept rolling. By March 31st, they reached the outskirts of Baghdad International Airport. The fighting had grown heavier. Rumors flew of Republican Guard units at hidden tank companies nearby, but the immediate goal was clear: seize and secure the airport. Smith's platoon was tasked with setting up a temporary holding area for enemy prisoners of war, EPWs. They selected a walled courtyard just off Highway 8, outside the airport's eastern perimeter. It looked ideal: reinforced concrete walls, multiple entry points, and a central tower. But looks can be deceiving. The compound had a key vulnerability: a breach in the north wall. And through that breach, unknown to them, Iraqi troops were massing. Smith ordered his men to fortify the area. They established security and prepared to receive prisoners. Meanwhile, vehicles from the 27 Infantry moved past them deeper into the airport grounds. For a brief moment, the engineers were alone, and that's when all hell broke loose. From the north and east, a force of roughly 50 to 100 Iraqi troops launched a coordinated counterattack. Mortars, RPGs, machine guns, the entire compound was suddenly under siege. Smith's men were caught in a kill zone. An M113 armored personnel carrier took a direct hit. Medics and mechanics, unarmed or lightly equipped, scrambled for cover. This wasn't an ambush, it was an attempt to wipe them out. The enemy wanted the courtyard back, and they were coming for it hard. Smith didn't freeze, he didn't panic, he moved. In seconds he was shouting orders, repositioning soldiers, grabbing a grenade launcher, and organizing a defense that would hold off a numerically superior force. The next 30 minutes would define the rest of his life. Because in that broken courtyard, surrounded and outgunned, Paul R. Smith was about to take the fight into his own hands. At 0730 hours, the first mortar shells hit. The courtyard erupted in a blast of smoke, dust, and panic. Dozens of U.S. soldiers, mechanics, medics, and engineers were in the open. Many had no direct combat assignment. Others were securing the compound perimeter. None of them expected a full-on infantry assault. But that's exactly what they got. From the north and east, a large Iraqi force surged towards the American position. Fedayeen fighters armed with AK-47s, RPGs, and mortars moved fast and aggressively through the gap in the wall. Their objective? Retake the compound, overrun the Americans, and destroy the key node protecting the airport's flank. Paul Smith saw the danger instantly. One of the unit's M113 armored personnel carriers was struck by RPG fire. It didn't explode, but the vehicle was disabled, and several soldiers were wounded. A 50 cal turret was now unmanned, and the only thing between the enemy and over 100 American troops was a shallow berm, a courtyard full of chaos, and one NCO with a plan. Smith started barking orders over the radio and to anyone within earshot. He ordered his men to form a hasty defensive line, assign fields of fire, and move the wounded to a safer position behind the courtyard wall. He picked up his M203 grenade launcher and began firing in controlled arcs, not just to kill, but to suppress and slow the Iraqi advance. Every second bought them more time for his team to regroup. When the enemy moved towards the main gate, Smith directed one of his soldiers to reposition a Bradley fighting vehicle for fire support. He coordinated the turret fire with his own grenade bursts, maximizing effect with minimal friendly exposure. Still, the Iraqis kept coming. Then he saw it, the abandoned M113 near the courtyard entrance. 50 caliber still mounted, still functional. And he made a choice. He climbed aboard. He had no gunner, no loader, no driver. He was completely exposed in the turret hatch, facing an enemy force outnumbering his platoon by at least 5 to 1. But the 50 cal, that was the answer. He locked in the butterfly triggers, aimed, and opened fire. Sustained burst ripped across the field. precision, and fury. Iraqi soldiers dropped in waves. Every tracer from the 50 cal was a line in the sand, drawn by one man against a tide of chaos. He didn't fire wildly, he fired with intent. He swept the breach, the gate, the flanks, anywhere the enemy moved, he met them with hell. It was loud, violent, and unrelenting. And for over 15 minutes it worked. Paul R. Smith turned a nearly overrun position into an anchored defense, and in doing so gave his men a fighting chance. But the cost was coming due, and he knew it. Paul R. Smith was no longer fighting as a squad leader, he was fighting as a one-man strongpoint. Exposed from the chest up in the hatch of an M113, he unleashed 50 caliber fire into wave after wave of enemy fighters. Iraqi troops surged through the breach and alleyways, using trees and ruined vehicles for cover. But every time they moved forward, Smith's machine gun roared them back. This wasn't a case of blind courage, it was pure tactical control of fire. Smith rotated his fields of fire constantly, sweeping from the gate to the flank, cutting off and filleting fire, preventing encirclement. He used short, controlled bursts, accurate, suppressive, relentless. Behind him, over 100 American soldiers, many of them wounded, unarmed, or under-equipped, were pinned in the courtyard. Engineers, medics, mechanics. If the enemy broke through, there would be a slaughter. But they didn't, because Smith wouldn't let them. From his elevated position, he directed supporting fire. He called out targets, he watched every movement, adjusted fire discipline, and held nothing back. The 50 cal burned hot. Magazine after magazine fed into its open jaws. Some soldiers tried to rotate in, to take the gun from him. He waved them off. This was his line, and he wasn't going to give it up. Enemy fighters managed to get within 25 meters. They fired RPGs, mortars, small arms, anything they had. Shell fragments tore into the M113's armor. Bullets pinged off the vehicle, and still, Smith kept fighting. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew he was exposed. He knew every round he fired was one less round aimed at his men. He didn't back down. He didn't flinch. He didn't get out. Eventually, one round found its mark. Paul R. Smith was hit in the head and killed instantly. But by then, the fight had turned. The enemy assault collapsed. More than 50 Iraqi soldiers were confirmed killed. The remaining survivors retreated. No Americans died in the courtyard, not one, because one man stood tall above the wall of chaos and refused to let it fall. When his body was recovered, the 50 caliber was nearly dry. He had fired over 300 rounds. The barrels were scorched, the vehicle peppered with shrapnel, but it had held, because he had. Paul R. Smith didn't die holding a position. He died holding the entire line. When the dust finally settled over the courtyard outside Baghdad International Airport, the American position was still intact, but only just. The ground was scorched, shell casings littered the pavement, smoke hung low over the walls, and the M113 where Paul R. Smith had made his stand was riddled with bullet holes and blackened from the heat of sustained fire. Inside the compound, medics emerged from cover, engineers rearmed, and infantry reinforcements arrived. The men who had hunkered down behind walls and Jersey barriers began to process what had just happened. They had been minutes from being overrun, and one man had turned the tide. There was no confusion about who that man was. Smith's team found him slumped in the gunner's hatch, lifeless, his hands still on the butterfly triggers of the 50 cal. He had fired until the final round. He had made no attempt to save himself. He had focused solely on repelling the assault. His soldiers, some of whom had only met him weeks before, stood in silence. A few wept, others just stared. They knew what they had just witnessed. Specialist James Smith, no relation, recalled that when the fighting started, you could hear the 50 cal going and going. We knew Sergeant Smith was up there. No one else was crazy enough to be on that gun. Later counts estimated that Smith had killed 20 to 50 enemy combatants. He had protected an area containing over 100 American troops, many of them non-combatants, and he had done so with no cover, no backup, and no exit plan. Witness statements flooded in. Sergeants, Privates, medics, even armor crewmen submitted sworn accounts of what had happened. The consensus was absolute. Had Paul Smith not acted the way he did, the courtyard would have fallen, and dozens of Americans would have died. His chain of command knew it too. Captain Michael Bliss, his company commander, described Smith as the kind of guy who, when everything was going wrong, was exactly who you wanted making the decisions. Commanders quickly realized this was no ordinary act of bravery. It was gallantry above and beyond. It was Medal of Honor territory. And so, while the war pushed deeper into Baghdad, a second battle quietly began, one to make sure Paul R. Smith's sacrifice would not be forgotten, buried, or lost in a footnote. It would take time. But the men who lived because of him were already telling anyone who would listen. He saved us. He led us. He never backed down. And now it was up to them to make sure the world knew his name. In the immediate days after the battle, paperwork and eyewitness accounts flooded up the chain of command. Soldiers, NCOs, and officers, many still reeling from the shock, sat down to record exactly what they had seen. One man holding off an enemy assault with nothing but willpower, tactics, and a 50 cal machine gun. The case was clear. The citations read like something out of a war movie, but it was real, verified, cross-referenced. There was no embellishment, just the cold, hard truth of what Paul R. Smith had done. The process to award the Medal of Honor began, and then the waiting. It would take 2 years of review. Every witness had to be interviewed, ballistics data checked, radio logs cross-referenced. Even the trajectory of RPGs was plotted. The military wasn't about to make a mistake, not on something this big. Meanwhile, back home, Smith's family grieved privately. His wife, Birgit, and their 2 children received the news through official channels. The Army took care of the details, but it couldn't replace the man. Still, his name began to spread, quietly at first, then faster. In unit briefings at Fort Stewart, in NCO academies, soldiers talked about him the way you talk about a myth that turned out to be real. Then came the confirmation. On April 4th, 2005, 2 years to the day after his death, President George W. Bush presented the Medal of Honor to Smith's 11-year-old son, David, in a solemn White House ceremony. Smith became the first and only Medal of Honor recipient for Operation Iraqi Freedom. In his remarks, President Bush said, "This nation will always be grateful to the brave and faithful soldier who gave all for his men." David Smith stood quietly, wearing his father's service cap. He didn't speak. He didn't need to, because by then the world knew. Paul R. Smith hadn't been in the wrong place at the wrong time. He'd been exactly where he needed to be, and he had made the ultimate sacrifice, not because he was asked, but because it was necessary. The medal was more than recognition. It was confirmation that in the most desperate moment, one man can still turn the tide. And sometimes that's enough to save everyone. Paul R. Smith didn't earn the Medal of Honor because he had a lucky moment. He earned it because every day before that moment, he acted like the kind of leader who would make that stand. His soldiers said he was relentless. He trained harder than anyone, demanded better from everyone, rehearsed until drills became muscle memory. There were no shortcuts in his squad, no good enough. Some troops hated it, but when the rounds started flying, they understood. Smith wasn't training them to look good on paper, he was preparing them to survive. There's a difference between authority and leadership. Smith had both. When chaos struck, he didn't ask who was in charge, he was in charge. He didn't ask for permission, he assessed, acted, and fought with absolute clarity. Even junior soldiers who clashed with him in garrison later admitted, "He was the reason I made it out." And Smith never played favorites. He chewed out lieutenants and corporals alike. If your gear wasn't squared away or your position wasn't defensible, he'd fix it, and you. But he never let his men face danger he wouldn't face himself. That's why he was the one on the 50 cal. He didn't order someone else into the turret, he went himself, because that was the kind of leader he was. He believed in the mission, But more than that, he believed in his people. In the weeks after his death, his unit put together a tribute. They found video clips of Smith teaching land navigation, wiring demolition charges, and giving safety briefs. They dug through photos of him in the field, in uniform, always focused, always intense. What they didn't find? A single moment of him slacking. Paul Smith didn't have an off switch. He lived like the next battle could start any minute, and in Iraq, he was right. The Army has since used his story in countless leadership courses. His actions have been studied by cadets, analyzed in command schools, and invoked in pre-deployment briefings. But no PowerPoint or training film can capture the raw presence he had in the field. Because Smith didn't just train leaders, he showed what one looked like. Paul R. Smith didn't live to see the legacy he created, but the impact of his actions continues to ripple through the U.S. Army and beyond. At Fort Stewart, Georgia, his home unit erected a memorial in his honor. His name was etched into stone, but more importantly, it was etched into the memory of every soldier who trained there. Smith Hall became more than a building, it became a standard. His story was incorporated into the curriculum of the U.S. Army Non-Commissioned Officer Academy, not as a footnote, as a case study in what it means to lead, in what it means to sacrifice, in what it means to act when everything is on the line. In Florida, the Paul R. Smith Middle School opened in 2006, dedicated in his name, his service, and his values. His widow, Birgit, stood beside the community that had raised him, sharing his story with students too young to remember the war, but old enough to learn the meaning of duty. Everywhere you go in the U.S. Army engineer community, his name carries weight. Posters, challenge coins, classroom quotes, do your job, lead from the front, never ask a soldier to do something you wouldn't do yourself. He wasn't a general, he didn't have a publicist, he didn't write a memoir, but he did something most men never do. He proved his principles at the cost of his life. For a new generation of soldiers, many of whom were still in middle school when he died, Smith's legacy isn't ancient history. It's immediate, raw, and real. The kind of story that makes you sit up straighter in your seat during a briefing. Even veterans from other branches speak his name with respect. Because while the battlefield has changed, new tech, new threats, new terrain, the core of leadership is not. Stand firm, protect your team, lead by example. Paul R. Smith did that. To the last round, to the last breath. And because of that, his name lives on, not in legend, but in fact, not in myth, but in memory. Not because the Army said so, but because the soldiers who lived because of him will never let it be forgotten. Before deploying to Iraq, Paul R. Smith told one of his team leaders something that would stick with him forever. If this goes bad, he said, I want them to say I fought like a lion. That wasn't a throwaway line. That was Smith's ethos. He wasn't interested in glory. He wasn't chasing medals. He simply wanted to be known as someone who did not run, no matter what. And in the end, that's exactly what he became. Smith's final stand wasn't just a gunfight. It was a display of absolute refusal to surrender ground. He didn't just man the gun. He owned the moment. While others found cover, he created cover with suppressive fire. While others sought leadership, he became it. There are stories in war that get cleaned up, mythologized, turned into movie scripts. This one doesn't need editing. It's brutal, unflinching, real. Smith's final action lasted under 30 minutes, but in that time he fired hundreds of rounds, coordinated defenses, evacuated wounded, directed fire support, and neutralized an entire assault force, all while knowing it would likely cost him everything. That's not just courage, that's commitment, that's leadership. His name is now engraved among the ranks of Medal of Honor recipients. But more than that, it's etched into the culture of the modern U.S. Army, because Paul R. Smith wasn't a relic, he wasn't a symbol. He was a man who faced death and stood tall, the kind of man who didn't wait for backup, who didn't hope someone else would act, who saw the line begin to break and decided, not today. If you visit the memorials, you'll see his face, his gear, his rifle, but you won't feel the full weight of what he did until you hear it from those who were there. And they'll tell you, he didn't flinch, he didn't hesitate, he fought like a lion, and because of that, they lived. I'm Dave Newton. I appreciate you watching. Subscribe for more amazing military history.